Welcome back to Savage Fabrication Instable Performance. This is going to be part 3 of the P-Pump series. This might be a short video, or we might do 2 things in one video, but one thing that we are going to do is go over the governor springs. Recently, we've had 2 call-ins for screwed up governor spring installs. So I'm going to go over how to do it the right way, what the springs are, and how to make fine adjustments once it's back together. So back on our table below, we have our wrecked 160 pump that has a seized rack. More than likely it actually has a seized barrel, so it's great for doing this stuff. So we're going to go down to our injection pump. Alright, so I have our pump down here. The first thing you're going to do when it's on the truck is you're going to take off all of the shut-off assembly.
Nope.
So there's 2 screws right here. There's going to be 1 screw down here. This one's always kind of a pain to do in the truck, but it has to come. You don't gotta take it out just loose. Actually, no, you can leave. Just take the shut-off solenoid off and you will have access to here. But you do need to get to the point where you can take this off. You do not need to unbolt. There's a little plate that comes off of here that swings over with a rod that attaches to the solenoid. This can all stay on. What you're gonna do is take this little 8mm loose and be very careful in the truck when you take this guy off, because when you take this off, there is a keyway in here. And you can now buy these keyways, but back in the day you could not. And if you lost this, you're in a heap of trouble. So they're not staked in normally, so when you do take the lever off, I advise you take the keyway out with it and put it where you will not lose it. With that off, we can take this cover off. This cover is our access to the governor assembly. 15/16, I think metric it's a 23, it could be off. 15/16 will take this guy off, I believe. Set to the side. When you take this cap off, you're going to drain out about 1/3 quart of oil, just because of this thing sitting on its side. It's going to leak that off. Is this in view? I have this tool that I got off eBay for rotating the pumps over when the cam gear is loose. You do not need the pump gear is loose. It was like $36. There was a more expensive one. I bought the cheaper one. It works great for doing timing adjustments, stuff like that. Normally when it's in the truck, you're just going to rotate it over using the alternator or the crank itself. For this video, we're going to be using this tool. So we can see there's 2, so there's one right here, and they're opposed from each other, 180 out, and there's the other one. So there's still some oil in this thing. So what we're going to do is, once we get these lined up in the hole, in front of the screen there. So once they're in the hole, you're good. Now, I've watched some videos and it's not a bad idea. You can put a business card in there and fold it so you do not drop anything in here. If you drop anything in here, the likelihood of you getting it out is very low. So if you have fumbly fingers, the business card trick is not a bad idea. I've never used it. I didn't actually even know about the business card trick until a few months ago. I've been doing this for years. What you're going to want to do is use a dowel caliper, extend it out, and I like to measure from the top of the nut. So this thing with the 2 slots in it is the nut. Measure from the top of the screw into the nut. So it's actually going to be the top of the nut to the top of the screw. So we have 0.050, 40 there, and it really depends on how square you're doing this. Sometimes I like to use the slots to go down. weird angle. Just try and hold this thing as square as you can. So inside the slot. So 0.0135. All you're doing is making sure we can put it back exactly how we found it. If you want to, take a picture of this with your phone once you've done this part. Once you've measured that height, you're going to record that height because we're going to go back to that height for initial startup. If we have to make a change, we'll make a change afterwards. Usually, you don't have to mess with it. The best way to get the nuts out, you can make a tool or a flat blade screwdriver and turn them out. So once they are loose, take your nut off. Now if you're worried about dropping the nut, you can put a magnet on it. Just want the nut. So here's your nut, and we can see the bottom of the nut. It's cammed, so there's the lobes. So when people talk about how many clicks their governor springs are at, they're talking about how many times the nut's cam lobes have made a rotation on the spring retainers. I'm going to take our top retainer off. So this is the upper, the upper spring retainer. Inside is what the cam lobes rotate on. If we take our nut in here, you can see it rotate up, down, up, down, up, down, up. So these are all the governor springs. Oh, hat's in the way, hopefully. So you're going to get all your springs. This is the lower retainer. There's no shims in this one. Sometimes there's shims at the very bottom of this. They sit, sometimes they sit above or below the retainer. So as their lower retainer, you usually won't change these out unless the kit wants you to change these out. Usually you're going to see that happen on the 5Ks and up. So this spring pack here is the speed control pack. So this inner pack controls see where it's going to govern out at. This big outer spring is called the idle spring. This sets where the pump's going to idle. What this means is if you have the tension on the nut set tighter, then the pump's going to idle at a higher idle RPM without you doing any changes to the idle adjustment. And if you have it set looser, it's going to idle at a lower RPM than what this here is. If the RPM is within maybe 200 RPMs of where it was when you finished the install, I would say just make the adjustment using the idle control here. 100, if it's 200 or less, change it with this. If it went from 700 to 1100 or 700 to won't idle, then you're going to need to make the adjustment using the nut tension on the idle spring. You either have it set too tight if the idle's too high, or you have it set too loose, the idle's too low. One of the things that does happen with this does play some role in the governing aspect of it, but this mainly controls the idle governor speed. Now what you can do, because what happens with say 4Ks, in gear they tend to actually govern out about between 35 and 3750. Now if you want your 4Ks in gear to go to 4,000 RPMs, what you can do, it will screw the idle up. It'll idle real bad because the governor assembly is trying to get the thing to idle, but you have the idle spring so tight that it just kind of wants to start to accelerate, so you can get a chop or a lope or just bad idle characteristics. But you can tighten up the idle setting, and by tightening up the nut you will increase the max RPM that it'll go to in gear. So in 4Ks in neutral we'll rev the 4K, but 4Ks when set up normally we'll rev to so 4Ks normally in gear will rev to about 3500, 3750. If you want in gear to get them up to 4000 for sled pulling or drag racing, you can tighten this guy up. Like I said, the trade-off is the idle quality goes down. There's no reason at all for them to be less than that. If it's just a 3K kit, this small spring will stay out. The 4K kit gets the small spring added into the center of the pack. Most kits have you remove all the shims at the bottom of the governor bucket. That's what we're going to call it. It's just a little bucket in there. Those shims really aren't needed. You can measure the shims and add that to what you're going to go back and set the nut to if you want to. If it just seems to be like it's a little bit low, like I said, if you put them back exactly how you got them, start it, you can now make educated adjustments. So if it's low, you can go and tighten up both sides, say 2 clicks or 1 click, because we know that both sides are now where they were, and they're not always the same because the machining's not always the same. So one side might be 0.010 lower or higher than the other one. Set it back exactly how it was, and then when we get to that point of starting up the engine, we can then go in and make a change. So reassembly, just as easy. Oops, totally forgot the lower bucket.
Don't need it.
So your lower spring bucket goes in. This holds the stack so all the springs sit to where they're supposed to be. You can do the big spring first on the truck. Kind of helps make this space smaller so you can't accidentally drop anything in there. The things are slotted, so this guy only goes on one way. It doesn't seem like there's too much here, but it's really not a complicated or tricky process. The big thing is to have the measurements. If you want to note the clicks when taking it apart, go for it. Kind of tested using measuring and clicks as like a backup plan if you lost the number, but the measurement is the for sure way to get it right the first time. So once it's all back in here, Come back in. Check that. It comes out to the same number. You are good to now move to the other side. We'll take this side apart real quick just to go over what we've done. If it wants to stay. The reason it wants to fall over is because we're playing with the cam lobes, and the return springs on the plungers want to drive the cam down to the lowest resistance position, the lowest spring pressure position on the return springs underneath the barrels. Don't over tighten any of this stuff when you're putting it back together. You can always go tighter if it's leaking. You can't go tighter if you strip it out. Oop. So, before we go that far, let's put it back where it was. We want to get our measurements. See, this one's a tenth higher. These spring settings are calibrated on a bench. They can see what the governor is doing on the bench and what the rack's doing, if the rack's kind of bouncing back and forth and stuff like that, and make adjustments, because two springs are quite made alike, so there's going to be slightly different settings. Based on if you have clumsy fingers, put something underneath to keep you from dropping anything if you're pretty confident with yourself. I've never done the business card trick. I thought that was a really quite nice trick. So nut, upper retainer, main governor spring pack, idle spring, lower spring retainer. This one's already been done, so that all the shims are missing. A lot of times there are shims on the bottom, and most kits will have you take the shims out. I don't know why the shims come out. Maybe because they're lower retainers. A lot of the kits have different lower retainer, and that lower retainer no longer needs the shims. Taking the shims out and then making the nut tighter versus leaving the shims in with the nut looser, it's probably going to do the exact same thing. So I don't really know what the point of it is. It is less stuff moving around in there, less weight maybe. And it helps its weight to get the stuff to get to the RPM that they want to get to. Reassembly. So your 3K kit usually will omit this small inner spring. So like a lot of kits are sold as a 3-4K, and if you want 3K, this one, 4K, this one, remember in gear you're going to lose about 250 to 500 RPMs depending on how the setting is. And just because you haven't set to where it can go to 4K just by no means means that you have to rev it to 4K. We run it's like a 6K governor in the pull truck, and we only turn 4,000 RPMs down the track, and the only way it's going to see 6K is if the trans was to, something in the trans or driveline failed while we have our foot to the floor, it will zing up that high. So that's kind of the only danger factor if you're worried about something in the drivetrain breaking while you're under full load, about it zinging all the way up. But that's what you got to do to compete. So that's on there. Go ahead and tighten this up. There being a little bit of a pain, you can just use 2 smaller screwdrivers. You can get your hands in there. So I'm seeing right now that it's like I'm a bit low. Sorry, a bit high. There we go. Go up. Make sure it's kind of resting in its base position. There we go, we're back to where we want to be. Put our cap back on. Keyway back in our shaft. If you want to put a little bit of grease on this keyway before you put it in, that's helpful. The pump in the truck is not leaning towards a favorable side. It's going to help hold it in place. When you go to put this back on, make sure it's not flush against the bottom. There's no thrust surface on this rotating shaft, so you can leave it a little bit high and make sure it spins without any roughness or whatever. We don't want it binding up on anything, getting caught on anything. We want full fuel while the truck's running, and we want the truck to turn off when we turn the truck off. The rest of your linkage is going to go back on, solenoid back on, tighten it up, and you're good to start it. One of the tricks you can do is don't put the solenoid on quite yet. Flip this into the run position, and you can start the truck. With governor springs, I've never had one run away, but you can always take the front of the intake off and have a board there in case something's going to happen. But it's a lot easier to make an adjustment, so when you get these all in here and ready to rock and roll, lever forward, start the truck. If it's high or low, you can then just go and turn the truck off, loosen the 8mm, pull the lever off, take your keyway out, take this guy out, rotate the motor until your governor springs are in the window. Again, it will make a mess every time you open this. And tighten or loosen both of them accordingly. You can go 2 revolutions at a time to make a change, and 1 at a time to make a change once you feel like you're getting close to where it should be. It should idle exactly how it did because we're using the same idle spring. Most of your governor spring kits all come with instructions, so just remember to abide by their instructions if they have any special requests, like leave the shims in, leave the shims out, and whatnot. The most important thing is if they say count the clicks, disregard that section and use a measuring device to measure the depth of the nut above the stud of the shaft. So I think that's about it for the governor side of things. It's really basic, really easy, and probably the best upgrade you can do on one of these trucks. So I think that about wraps it up for the governor springs. There's not a whole lot to them. You can't really mess them up as long as you're very careful. Follow all the instructions that come with the kit. Like I said, the whole clicks thing, maybe back in the day, but if you want to do it the right way the first time and so you know where things are at, use a measuring device. Caliper works great. As far as this, you can find these on eBay. They're threaded for the pump shaft, and the nut just threads on, and then this jams up against the snub, and this lets it move the pump wherever. They work great for timing. So once the pump gear is loose, and when you pop the gear loose and the pump spun because of the return spring pressure, when plungers want to turn the cam, you can get the pump back to where it needs to be. You don't got to use the engine to move the pump around before pulling the gear off. It makes it really easy. You'll need a smaller size magnet to pull parts out, a flat blade screwdriver to turn the adjusting nut on the governor system themselves, 8mm, 10mm, and that's about it. It's really easy, really basic. One thing that we do recommend is most gov spring kits come with you can get them with the valve spring package as well. We recommend if you're going to turn more than 3,000 RPMs, 2750, 3000, that you do the 60-pound spring upgrade kit. Power driven diesel offers better locks and retainers than the factory, with a 60-pound spring kit, which is great. We've only ever, in the course of doing this stuff, had a single factory lock and retainer fail. And we got lucky, didn't like hurt the engine, anything like that. Put a set of used locks and retainers back in it because what we had, and got the thing running. But they sell a upgrade kit that'll make that completely go away, and it makes the 60-pound springs great. Most of the trucks should come with 60-pound springs. One recommendation on a 12 valve of doing the 60-pound springs is to run a high pressure oil additive, so a zinc additive or Lucas oil stabilizer. The factory cam lobe width and lifter width was designed for older oils that had this zinc in it, and the factory spring pressure, when you bump the spring pressure up, with today's oils that are out there, there's a much higher likelihood that you'll start to cause pitting on the camshaft lobes. So that's another little side thing. Now, thank you for watching. I hope that we went over doing the governor spring thing pretty well. There's not a whole lot more to talk about it. It's really straightforward. It's just measuring and working and just not being in a hurry. You don't want to drop anything down into the governor assembly case because you'll probably never get it back out. Just put it back how you found it, and that's how you can make small adjustments. If you're drag racing sled pulling and you're trying to get more RPMs out of it, certainly you can tighten them up and then drop the idle down if you need to. Just make sure you don't get too wild there. There's a point where you should just go to a 5K, a 6K, or the unlimited governor from South Farrell. So that's all options you can do. So this is Savage Fabrication, Instant Spool Performance. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you on the next video. Bye.